In the frozen mud of Belgium during the winter of 1944, there existed a particular kind of silence that soldiers learned to fear. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence that preceded catastrophe, the kind that settled over snow-covered fields just before the earth erupted in fire and steel. In the final weeks of December, as the German Wehrmacht launched its desperate gamble through the Ardennes forest, this silence became the constant companion of thousands of American soldiers who suddenly found themselves fighting not for victory, but for survival. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would come to be known, represented Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front. The plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its execution. 3 German armies, comprising more than 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks, smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. The objective was simple in concept, devastating in implication: drive west to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace that might save the Third Reich from total destruction. For the Americans caught in the path of this avalanche of armor and artillery, the first days of the offensive brought confusion, retreat, and the bitter taste of desperation. Among the units thrown into chaos by the German assault was the 7th Armored Division, a formation that had fought its way across France with distinction, but now found itself engaged in a fighting retreat through frozen Belgian countryside. The division's maintenance companies, those unglamorous units responsible for keeping tanks running and weapons functioning, suddenly discovered that the rear areas they had occupied were now the front lines. Mechanics who had spent months wrestling with broken transmissions and fouled fuel lines were handed rifles and told to hold positions that appeared on no strategic maps, but mattered desperately in the immediate mathematics of survival. Staff Sergeant Thomas Edward Brennan was 31 years old in December 1944, which made him ancient by the standards of the armored divisions. He had joined the Army in 1942, not out of patriotic fervor, but because the alternative was unemployment in a Pennsylvania steel town that had already given most of its young men to the war effort. Brennan was not an idealist. He was a pragmatist who understood machines better than he understood people, a man more comfortable with a wrench than a weapon. His personnel file noted his proficiency with the M4 Sherman tank and its variants, his ability to diagnose mechanical failures under field conditions, and his complete lack of interest in promotion beyond his current rank. He was exactly the kind of soldier the Army needed in its maintenance units: competent, reliable, and content to remain invisible. The maintenance company to which Brennan belonged had established itself in a small Belgian village called Chaumont, a collection of perhaps 40 stone houses clustered around a medieval church whose bell tower had long since been silenced by artillery fire. The village sat astride a secondary road that twisted through hills covered in pine forest, a road that was supposed to be well behind American lines. On the morning of December 18th, when the maintenance company was roused by the sound of distant artillery, that assumption proved fatally incorrect. By noon, refugees were streaming past the village, Belgian civilians pulling carts loaded with possessions, their faces carrying that particular blankness that comes from having witnessed the same catastrophe twice in a single lifetime. By evening, American infantry were falling back through Chaumont, and the maintenance company received orders to evacuate. But evacuation, like so many military operations, proved easier to order than to execute. The company had 6 Sherman tanks, in various states of disrepair, vehicles that had been pulled from frontline units for overhaul and now sat in a muddy field beside the village. 2 of the Shermans could be made operational within hours. 3 others needed parts that were somewhere in the supply chain but had not yet arrived. The 6th Sherman, a tank designated M4A1 number 30-31-44-7, had thrown a track 2 days earlier and suffered damage to its transmission that would require a complete replacement. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a total loss. The company commander, a harried captain named Morrison, made the obvious decision: cannibalize the broken Sherman for parts, destroy what remained,
and retreat west with the functioning vehicles. Brennan spent the night of December 18th following these orders, working by the light of hooded lanterns to strip useful components from the disabled tank. The night was brutally cold, the kind of cold that made metal brittle and turned lubricating oil into something with the consistency of molasses. His hands, even in lined gloves, ached with a deep pain that settled into the bones. Around him, the village was transforming into a ghost town as the maintenance company loaded its trucks and prepared to withdraw. Somewhere to the east, the artillery fire had grown closer. No longer distant thunder, but immediate concussion, the kind that made the ground shake and set loose snow falling from pine branches. By dawn on December 19th, the evacuation was nearly complete. The two operational Shermans had been driven out hours earlier, heading west to what everyone hoped were stable American lines. Most of the company's personnel had departed in a convoy of trucks, leaving behind only a small rear guard to complete the destruction of equipment that could not be moved. Brennan was part of this rear guard, along with 6 other soldiers and Lieutenant Hammond, a young officer who had been with the division for less than 3 months and carried his authority like an unfamiliar coat. The plan called for demolition charges to be placed in the disabled Sherman and the remaining mechanical equipment, timed to detonate after the rear guard had withdrawn. It was standard procedure, the kind of thing that happened 1,000 times during the war. But as Brennan moved through the frozen morning, preparing the charges that would destroy the machine he had spent the night trying to salvage, he found himself thinking about waste. The Sherman, even broken, represented hundreds of hours of labor in factories across America, tons of steel that had been mined and smelted and formed, transported across an ocean and delivered to this insignificant Belgian village only to be blown apart before it ever fired another shot in combat.
There was a practical consideration as well, one that Brennan mentioned to Lieutenant Hammond as they worked. The disabled Sherman still had a functioning turret, a working main gun, and ammunition. Its armor, while not impervious to German anti-tank weapons, still offered more protection than a foxhole. If the German advance continued through Chaumont, and if that advance included armor, the wrecked Sherman might serve some purpose beyond its destruction. Hammond listened to this assessment with the expression of a man trying to calculate odds that kept changing. He was not a fool, this young lieutenant. He understood that the situation was fluid, that orders made sense only until circumstances rendered them obsolete. After a long silence, punctuated by the sound of incoming artillery landing perhaps 2 kilometers to the east, Hammond made a decision that would be neither recorded in official reports nor mentioned in citations. The rear guard would hold in Chaumont for another 6 hours, until mid-afternoon, to serve as a tripwire in case German armor appeared on the road. If the Germans came with force, the rear guard would withdraw. If they did not, the rear guard would complete the demolition and withdraw anyway. But in those 6 hours, if Brennan thought he could make the disabled Sherman into something useful, he had permission to try. It was not an order. It was not even a suggestion. It was simply an absence of prohibition, which, in military terms, sometimes amounted to the same thing. What Brennan accomplished in those 6 hours would have been impossible under normal circumstances, which perhaps explained why it worked under circumstances that were anything but normal. The broken Sherman could not move. Its transmission was destroyed beyond field repair, and its thrown track lay in frozen segments nearby. But immobility was not the same as uselessness. Brennan understood that a tank, reduced to its essential nature, was simply a gun behind armor. If the gun worked and the armor held, everything else was optimization. The first task was to ensure the turret could traverse. The Sherman's electric traverse system ran off the main engine, which was inoperable. But the turret also had a manual traverse system, a hand crank that allowed the crew to rotate the turret slowly through brute force. Brennan spent an hour working on the traverse mechanism, lubricating gears that had frozen overnight, testing the hand crank until he was satisfied that the turret could be moved, albeit slowly. The main gun, a 75mm M3, appeared functional. Brennan cycled the breech mechanism, checked the recoil system, and satisfied himself that the gun would fire if called upon to do so. Ammunition was less of a concern. The Sherman carried 75 rounds of 75mm ammunition, a mix of armor-piercing, high-explosive, and smoke rounds. Most of this ammunition remained in the tank's storage racks, untouched by whatever mechanical failure had disabled the transmission. Brennan reorganized the ammunition, placing armor-piercing rounds within easy reach of the loader's position and relegating high-explosive rounds to secondary storage. He was preparing for a specific eventuality, one that required no imagination because it was already written in the tactical situation. If German armor came down the road toward Chaumont, and if that advance included armor, the wrecked Sherman might serve some purpose beyond its destruction. The second task was positioning. The Sherman sat in an open field perhaps 60 meters from the main road, angled slightly away from the optimal firing position. It was too heavy to move by hand and lacked the functioning engine that might have repositioned it under its own power. But Brennan had spent years working with heavy equipment, and he understood leverage. Using a combination of jacks, timber, and brute human effort, he and 2 other soldiers from the rear guard managed to rotate the Sherman approximately 15 degrees, bringing its gun to bear more directly on a straight stretch of road visible from the turret.
The positioning was still not ideal. The Sherman remained in open ground with minimal cover, visible to anyone approaching from the east. But there was no time to dig it in or construct camouflage, and perhaps there was no point. If the Germans came with infantry and time, they would discover the Sherman and destroy it with anti-tank weapons. If they came with armor but no time, they might not notice the disabled tank until it was too late. It was a gamble predicated on speed, surprise, and the arrogance of an advancing force that believed the battle was already won. By noon, the work was complete. The Sherman was ready to fire, its gun loaded with an armor-piercing round, its turret hand-cranked to face east along the road. Brennan climbed inside the tank and sat in the gunner's position, studying the view through the gun sight. The optics were good, showing a clear view of the road as it descended a slight hill and straightened through Chaumont. The range to the straight section was perhaps 300 meters, close enough for accurate fire, but not so close that missing would be forgiven. It was, Brennan calculated, about as good as the situation allowed. The afternoon settled into waiting, that particular military purgatory where time simultaneously crawled and disappeared. Lieutenant Hammond established the rear guard in positions around the village, soldiers in cellars and behind stone walls, spread thin enough to see approaching danger, but not dense enough to hold against a serious attack. The plan remained simple: observe, report, and withdraw. The disabled Sherman was never meant to be the centerpiece of a defense. It was meant to be a last resort, a mechanical ambush for an enemy that was not supposed to arrive. At 1400 hours, scouts reported movement to the east. Not infantry, not trucks, but the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles moving cross-country. The sound grew closer over the next 20 minutes, a low mechanical rumble that carried through the frozen air like approaching thunder. Hammond, using binoculars from the church tower, confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect. German armor, at least 2 vehicles, moving directly toward Chaumont along the secondary road. He radioed this information to division headquarters, received acknowledgement, and was told to withdraw immediately. The rear guard was not equipped or positioned to contest an armored advance, and there was no strategic value in sacrificing 7 men to delay the inevitable by minutes. Hammond climbed down from the church tower and began moving between positions, quietly ordering his soldiers to fall back to the trucks that waited on the western edge of the village. The withdrawal was to be conducted in sequence, with men leaving their positions in pairs to avoid presenting a target. It was professional, organized, and entirely sensible. Brennan, sitting in the Sherman's turret, heard none of this. The tank's radio had been disconnected during maintenance and never reinstalled. He was isolated, both physically and informationally, in a steel box that had become his entire world. What Brennan saw, through the gun sight, was a Tiger tank cresting the hill to the east. The Tiger I IE was arguably the most feared tank of the Second World War, a mobile fortress whose reputation often exceeded its actual battlefield utility, but whose presence on the field was never anything less than terrifying. Armed with the 88mm QWK-36 gun, protected by frontal armor up to 100mm thick, the Tiger represented a qualitative superiority that Allied tank crews understood intellectually but felt viscerally every time they engaged one in combat. The standard tactical doctrine for Sherman crews facing a Tiger was to use numbers, maneuver, and speed. Multiple Shermans would attempt to flank the Tiger, accepting losses in order to get side or rear shots where the German tank's armor was vulnerable. But doctrine assumed mobility, support, and numbers. Brennan had none of these. The Tiger that appeared on the road was moving with the confidence of a predator that had not encountered serious resistance in days. It was traveling at perhaps 20 kilometers per hour, turret transversed forward, heading directly toward Chaumont with the casual arrogance of a vehicle that believed itself invulnerable. Behind it, perhaps 500 meters back, Brennan could see the dark shape of a second tank, though he could not identify its type through the gun sight. The tactical situation was clear and catastrophic. If the Tiger continued through the village, it would discover the American rear guard, still in the process of withdrawing. Men would die in the next few minutes, killed by a machine gun and a cannon that could turn stone walls into shrapnel. Brennan understood that engaging the Tiger was essentially suicide. The Sherman's 75mm gun, firing standard armor-piercing ammunition, could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges. The best he could hope for was to damage the Tiger's tracks or vision ports, neither of which would guarantee a kill. More likely, the first shot would alert the Tiger to his presence, and the Tiger would simply rotate its turret and obliterate the disabled Sherman with a single shot from the 88mm gun. It would be over in seconds, and no one would ever know that Brennan had tried. But there was a chance, infinitesimally small, but mathematically non-zero, predicated on three factors that aligned in that moment like the tumbler of some cosmic lock. First, the Tiger was moving, which meant its gunner would need time to acquire and fire on a stationary target. Second, the Sherman was positioned at an angle that presented a narrow profile, which might cause initial ranging errors. Third, and most critical, Brennan was not planning to engage the Tiger's frontal armor. The Sherman carried, in addition to its standard ammunition load, 3 rounds of a particular type, M61 armor-piercing capped ballistic capped rounds with an explosive filler. These rounds, delivered just weeks earlier, were designed to improve penetration against sloped armor through improved ballistics and post-penetration effect. They were still not sufficient to penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. But the Tiger, like all tanks, had vulnerable points. The engine deck, the turret ring, the lower hull, the vision ports, and most critically, if a Tiger could be forced to turn, if it exposed its side armor to engage a threat, its armor thickness dropped from 100mm to 80mm. At 300 meters, with the right ammunition and an element of surprise, 80mm was penetrable.
Brennan's plan, such as it was, consisted of 2 shots. The first shot would be aimed at the Tiger's track, specifically the section where the track wrapped around the drive sprocket. A hit there might immobilize the Tiger, or at least damage it enough to force the crew to stop and assess. More importantly, it would announce the Sherman's presence and location. The Tiger would react by traversing its turret to engage the threat. In doing so, it would present its side armor. The second shot, fired during this traverse, would target the side hull just below the turret ring. It was a shot that required timing, accuracy, and fortune. If it failed, Brennan would have perhaps 3 seconds before the Tiger returned fire. He began the engagement at 1417 hours, according to the Sherman's chronometer, though later he would have no memory of noting the time. His hands moved through the sequence of actions as they had been trained to move, mechanical and certain. Right hand on the traversing wheel, making minute adjustments to track the Tiger as it approached. Left hand on the elevation wheel, setting the range. Eye pressed to the rubber cup of the gun sight, watching the German tank grow larger in the reticle. Foot poised above the firing pedal, waiting for the moment when probability shifted from impossible to merely improbable.
The Tiger was at 320 meters when Brennan fired the first shot. The 75-millimeter gun roared in the enclosed space of the turret, filling the air with smoke and the smell of burned propellant. The Sherman rocked back on its suspension from the recoil, and through the gun sight, Brennan watched the tracer arc across the frozen field toward the moving target. The round struck low, hitting not the track, but the road surface just in front of the Tiger, sending up a fountain of frozen earth and gravel. It was a miss, but a miss that achieved its purpose. The Tiger stopped. In the 4 seconds that followed, Brennan hand-cranked the turret traverse wheel with desperate speed, shifting the gun's aim toward where the Tiger's side would appear as its turret rotated to engage. This was the critical moment, the fulcrum on which everything balanced. The Tiger's commander, having identified the threat, would be giving orders. The gunner would be traversing the turret looking for the source of the incoming fire. The driver might be reversing or attempting to angle the hull for better protection. All of these actions took time, but not much time. Brennan had perhaps 5 seconds before the Tiger's 88-millimeter gun was pointed at his position. He fired this second shot without conscious thought, in that state of mechanical execution where training supersedes fear. This shot flew true, crossing the 300 meters of frozen Belgian countryside in less than a second, and striking the Tiger on its right side, just below the turret ring. The armor-piercing round punched through the 80-millimeter side plate, penetrated the fighting compartment, and detonated among the ammunition stored in the hull. What happened next was not a Hollywood explosion, but something more terrible and final. The Tiger simply died. Smoke began pouring from its hatches. The turret, halfway through its traverse, stopped moving. And then, perhaps 10 seconds after the penetration, the stored ammunition cooked off in a muffled series of detonations that blew the turret completely off the hull, sending it tumbling onto the road in a cloud of black smoke and burning fuel. Brennan sat in the gunner's seat, hands still on the controls, watching the Tiger burn. His ears rang from the cannon fire. His hands shook not from fear, but from adrenaline, that chemical flood that the body releases when death comes close and then, impossibly, retreats. Around him, the Sherman's interior was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. The main gun was still loaded with an armor-piercing round, and somewhere in the mechanical part of his mind, Brennan noted that he had 1 shot remaining before needing to reload. The second German tank, the one that had been trailing the Tiger, had stopped at the sound of firing. Through the gun sight, he could see it sitting on the hillside, approximately 800 meters distant, too far for accurate fire with the Sherman's gun. For a long moment, nothing happened. The second tank sat motionless, and Brennan sat motionless, and between them the Tiger burned like a funeral pyre. Then, with the speed that suggested panic rather than tactics, the second tank reversed course and disappeared back over the hill. It did not return.
Lieutenant Hammond found Brennan 15 minutes later, still sitting in the Sherman's turret, still watching the burning Tiger through the gun sight. The lieutenant climbed onto the tank's hull and knocked on the turret hatch, and when Brennan finally opened it and emerged into the winter air, Hammond's first words were not congratulations or questions, but a simple observation. "We need to leave. Now." The rear guard withdrew from Chaumont at approximately 1500 hours, traveling west in 2 trucks that carried 7 soldiers who should have been dead. Behind them, the village returned to its stunned silence, broken only by the crackle of flames from the destroyed Tiger and the occasional crash of falling masonry from buildings damaged in earlier artillery barrages. The disabled Sherman, having fired its 2 shots and changed the tactical equation for reasons that would never appear in official histories, sat alone in the frozen field. Demolition charges had been placed during the final minutes of the evacuation, timed to detonate after the trucks had cleared the village. When those charges exploded at 1500 hours, they erased the evidence of what had occurred, reducing the Sherman to twisted metal and scattered components. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month, a savage grinding match fought in snow and fog that ultimately ended in German defeat and the complete exhaustion of Wehrmacht offensive capability. The 7th Armored Division continued to fight throughout the battle, suffering heavy casualties, but maintaining its cohesion as a fighting force. Staff Sergeant Thomas Brennan remained with the division's maintenance company, continuing to repair tanks and maintain equipment until the war in Europe ended in May 1945. His personnel file recorded no decorations for the action at Chaumont because no formal after-action report was ever filed. In the chaos of the Bulge's first week, when entire units were being overrun and communication networks were shattered, a rearguard action that resulted in no friendly casualties and delayed a German advance by less than an hour simply disappeared into the noise. Hammond mentioned the engagement in a letter to his parents, written 3 weeks after the fact, in which he described one of our mechanics destroying a Tiger tank with a broken Sherman. The letter survived the war in a shoebox of correspondence, was donated to a historical society in 1987, and was cataloged but never published. Brennan himself spoke of the engagement only once, in 1952, to a newspaper reporter writing about local veterans. His account was brief and technical, focused on the mechanical challenges of operating a disabled tank rather than the emotional weight of the engagement. The resulting article, published in a small Pennsylvania newspaper, ran under a headline that emphasized his local origins rather than his actions. Steeltown veteran recalls war service. What we know about the engagement at Chaumont comes from the convergence of 3 sources, none of which alone would be sufficient, but which together paint a picture that is probably accurate in its broad strokes, if uncertain in its details. The first source is Hammond's letter, which provides the only contemporary account and establishes the basic facts: date, location, and outcome. The second source is the 7th Armored Division's daily operational logs, which record the loss of a Tiger tank to unknown causes on December 19, 1944, in the vicinity of Chaumont. The German unit that lost the Tiger, the 1st SS Panzer Division, noted the loss in its own records, but attributed it to enemy anti-tank fire, which was technically accurate, if incomplete. The third source is Brennan himself, whose interview in 1952 provides technical details that correspond with the capabilities of the M4A1 Sherman and the tactical situation as it existed in late December 1944. What these sources cannot tell us is what Brennan was thinking in the moments before he fired, or how Hammond justified the decision to allow a single soldier to remain in an indefensible position, or whether the other members of the rearguard understood what Brennan was attempting. The historical record preserves facts, but often loses meaning, reducing human decisions to tactical abstractions. We know that a disabled American tank destroyed a German Tiger tank under circumstances that should have made such a kill impossible. We know that this action allowed 7 American soldiers to withdraw safely from a position that was about to be overrun. We know that the German advance through that particular sector was delayed by several hours, which in the context of the Battle of the Bulge's first week meant that other American units had time to establish defensive positions that might otherwise have been overwhelmed. What we cannot know with certainty is whether Brennan's decision was brave or foolish, whether Hammond's decision was wise or negligent, or whether the entire engagement was a calculated risk or a desperate improvisation that happened to succeed. The line between heroism and recklessness is often clear only in retrospect, and even then only to people who were not present when the decision had to be made. What we can say with confidence is that on a frozen Belgian afternoon in December 1944, at a moment when the outcome of the war still felt uncertain and the cost of defeat felt personally imminent, a mechanic who understood machines better than he understood heroism made a machine do something it was not designed to do, and in so doing reminded everyone who later learned of his actions that wars are ultimately won or lost not by the grand strategies of generals, but by the competence and courage of individual soldiers at the point of decision. The Tiger tank that burned on the road outside Chaumont was one of approximately 450 Tigers destroyed by Allied forces during the Second World War. It represented the loss of a vehicle that had required tens of thousands of man-hours to manufacture, that consumed resources the German war economy could not afford to lose, and whose destruction removed from the battlefield a weapon system that required multiple Allied tanks to engage with any hope of success. In the vast accounting of the war, it was a minor loss,
a single data point in casualty reports that tracked losses by the hundreds and thousands. But to the soldiers of the American rear guard who withdrew safely from Chaumont that afternoon, it was everything.
Brennan survived the war and returned to Pennsylvania, where he worked for 33 years as a maintenance supervisor in the same steel mill that had laid him off in 1942. He married in 1947, raised 3 children, and lived a life that appeared unremarkable to those who did not know to look for the remarkable within it. He died in 1989 at the age of 76, having outlived most of his wartime comrades and the war itself by 4 decades. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in a single sentence, noting that he had served in the 7th Armored Division during World War II. It did not mention Chaumont, or the Tiger, or the disabled Sherman that fired 2 shots and changed the tactical equation for 7 soldiers whose names would never appear in the official histories. The historical record of the Second World War contains millions of such omissions, actions and decisions that mattered desperately to the people involved, but failed to rise to the level of historical significance in the broader narrative of the conflict. We remember the major battles, the turning points, the decisions that affected the course of nations. We forget the small actions, the individual decisions, the moments when a single person chose to stand when retreat was both logical and permissible. And yet the war was made of these moments, thousands upon thousands of them, accumulating into the vast statistical mass that we call victory or defeat. The disabled Sherman at Chaumont fired 2 shots. The first missed its target, but achieved its purpose, announcing a threat and forcing a response. The second hit true, penetrating armor and destroying a machine that should have been invulnerable. In the mechanics of warfare, in the physics of armor penetration and the mathematics of probability, it was an outcome that existed at the far edge of possibility. In the human calculus of courage and competence, it was something that happened because a mechanic understood that a broken machine could still serve a purpose, and because he was willing to sit in that machine and pull a trigger when every rational calculation suggested that doing so was futile. There was a photograph taken in 1985 by a Belgian amateur historian that shows the field outside Chaumont where the engagement occurred. The village has changed little in the 40 years since the war. The stone houses remain, weathered and stolid. The church tower still stands, though its bell has never been replaced. The secondary road still winds through hills covered in pine forest, carrying traffic that has no memory of tanks or terror. In the field where the Sherman sat, there is nothing but grass and a small memorial stone, placed there by the village in 1975, that notes in French and English that American soldiers fought here in December 1944. The stone does not mention names or details. It simply marks the ground where something happened, where history touched the earth and then moved on. The study of military history is ultimately the study of human beings under extreme conditions, making decisions with incomplete information and living or dying with the consequences. We analyze tactics and strategy, examine weapon systems and logistics, debate command decisions and political calculations, but beneath all of this analysis lies the inescapable fact that wars are fought by individuals, people with names and lives and futures that may or may not survive the next hour. Staff Sergeant Thomas Brennan, sitting in the turret of a disabled tank on a frozen Belgian afternoon, was such a person. He was not a hero in the Hollywood sense, not a man who sought glory or believed himself capable of impossible feats. He was a mechanic who understood machines and understood in that moment that he had a choice between attempting something that would probably fail and abandoning men who would probably die. The choice he made was not complicated. It did not require philosophical deliberation or moral calculation. It required only the willingness to accept the likely consequences of failure and the competence to maximize the slim chances of success. That he succeeded, that the armor-piercing round penetrated where it struck, that the Tiger burned instead of firing back, was a function of skill and fortune in proportions that can never be precisely calculated. That he tried, knowing the odds and accepting them, is the only part of the story that matters when we ask what kind of courage the war demanded from the people who fought it. In the decades after the war, as the generation that fought it aged and passed, and memory gave way to history, there were periodic efforts to document the smaller actions, the forgotten engagements, the individual decisions that never made it into the official record. Historians interviewed veterans, collected letters and diaries, examined unit records and after-action reports, trying to reconstruct what actually happened in the confusion of combat. Some of these efforts succeeded in recovering stories that would otherwise have been lost. Many did not, because the people who remembered were gone, or because the records had been destroyed, or because no one thought to ask the right questions while answers were still possible.
The story of Chaumont survives because of luck as much as documentation. Hammond's letter might have been thrown away. Brennan might have refused to speak to the newspaper reporter. The German unit records might have been lost in the chaos of the war's end. But these things did not happen, and so we have fragments of a story that can be assembled into something that resembles truth. It is not complete. It cannot be complete. Too much has been lost. Too much was never recorded. Too much depended on the internal thoughts of people who are no longer alive to ask. But what remains is enough to establish that something significant happened in that frozen Belgian field. Something that tells us about the nature of warfare and the nature of the people who fight it. The Tiger tank, that symbol of German armored superiority, was ultimately a machine built by human beings and destroyed by human beings. Its thick armor and powerful gun made it formidable but not invincible. Its crew, well-trained and experienced though they were, could be surprised and killed. The Sherman tank, that symbol of American industrial capacity, was ultimately a machine that succeeded not because it was superior in design, but because it was available in numbers, and because the people who operated it found ways to overcome its deficiencies. The engagement at Chaumont demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of these machines, and the crucial importance of the human beings who employed them. What makes the story worth remembering is not that Brennan destroyed a Tiger tank, though that was the tactical outcome. What makes it worth remembering is that he chose to try, knowing that trying was probably futile, because the alternative was watching men die when there existed even a small possibility of preventing it. This is not the kind of heroism that appears in citations or decorations. It is not the kind of courage that lends itself to dramatic retelling or public celebration. It is simply the kind of decision that soldiers throughout history have had to make. The decision to act when action is dangerous and inaction is unbearable. The war in Europe ended 5 months after the engagement at Chaumont, concluded by the overwhelming force of Allied armies that crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany. The Battle of the Bulge, that last desperate German gamble, ended in complete failure, exhausting Wehrmacht reserves and hastening the collapse of German resistance. The 7th Armored Division participated in the final campaigns, crossing into Germany and helping to secure the Ruhr industrial region before the war ended in May 1945. Brennan was there for all of it, repairing tanks and maintaining equipment, doing the unglamorous work that kept the division mobile and effective. He received no medals for Chaumont because the action was never formally documented. He received no public recognition because the story was never publicized. He simply continued doing his job until the job was finished, and then he went home. This is how most military service ends, not with triumph or tragedy, but simply going home. The vast majority of soldiers who serve in wartime do so without committing acts that rise to the level of historical notice. They perform their assigned tasks with competence and courage, endure the hardships and dangers that war imposes, and then return to civilian life, where their service becomes a part of their personal history, but not of public memory. Brennan was such a soldier. The fact that he briefly, for the span of perhaps 2 minutes, stepped outside this pattern and did something that would later be recognized as extraordinary, does not change the basic arc of his service. He was a mechanic who repaired tanks, who happened to fire a tank gun twice under circumstances that made those 2 shots significant. The question that the story raises, the question that all such stories raise, is what we owe to the people who make these decisions. Not the generals whose names appear in textbooks, not the politicians whose speeches shape public memory, but the individual soldiers who choose action over safety at the point where it matters. Do we owe them recognition, documentation, public acknowledgement of their service? Or is it enough that they survived, that they went home, that they lived the rest of their lives with the knowledge that they did what needed to be done when it needed to be done?
There is no easy answer to this question because the answer depends on what we believe military service means and what we believe society owes to those who serve. What we can say with certainty is that stories like Brennan's, multiplied across thousands of similar moments and millions of individual decisions, represent the actual texture of military conflict in ways that strategic histories and tactical analyses cannot capture. They remind us that wars, for all their vast scope and historical significance, are ultimately personal experiences, lived by individuals who must make immediate decisions based on incomplete information, and live with the consequences forever. The field outside Chaumont, where the engagement occurred, is peaceful now, has been peaceful for 80 decades. The scars of war have healed or been covered over by the patient work of nature and human reconstruction. Farmers have plowed the ground where tanks once fought. Children play in fields where men once died. The village has returned to the quiet rhythms of rural Belgian life, marked by seasons rather than campaigns, by harvests rather than battles. Only the memorial stone remains to suggest that something significant occurred here, and even that stone speaks in the vague language of commemoration rather than the specific vocabulary of tactical action.
This erasure is perhaps inevitable. Battlefields cannot remain battlefields forever. The land must return to productive use. The living must reclaim spaces that the dead once occupied. But something is lost in this process. Some understanding of what actually occurred and what it cost. The field at Chaumont looks like any other field now, unremarkable in its ordinariness, giving no hint of the violence it once witnessed or the terror it once contained. A visitor who did not know the history would see nothing to distinguish this place from 1,000 other Belgian fields, nothing to suggest that a mechanic once sat in a disabled tank and made a decision that saved 7 lives at the probable cost of his own. The weapon that Brennan fired, the 75mm M3 gun mounted in the Sherman's turret, was, by 1944 standards, an obsolescent piece of equipment. It had been designed in the late 1930s, based on a French artillery piece, and adapted for use in tanks through a series of compromises that favored reliability over performance. By the time the Battle of the Bulge began, American tankers knew that the 75mm gun was inadequate against German heavy armor. They knew that engaging a Tiger or Panther from the front was suicide. They knew that their best hope lay in mobility, numerical superiority, and favorable terrain. Brennan had none of these advantages, and yet the obsolescent gun did what it was designed to do. It fired. The round struck home. The Tiger burned. This outcome should not be read as a vindication of the Sherman's design or as evidence that American tanks were adequate to the task they faced. The Sherman was, in many respects, an inferior fighting vehicle compared to German heavy tanks, a fact that American tankers paid for with their lives throughout the war. What the engagement at Chaumont demonstrates is not the superiority of American equipment, but the effectiveness of American training and the resourcefulness of American soldiers. Brennan succeeded not because his tank was better, but because he understood its limitations and found a way to exploit the enemy's vulnerabilities within those constraints. This is a different kind of victory than the one achieved through technological superiority, more personal and more fragile, but no less real. The Tiger that Brennan destroyed was recovered by American forces after the area was secured several weeks later. The wreck was examined by intelligence officers interested in understanding German tank design and by salvage teams looking for recoverable components. The examination confirmed that the kill had been achieved by a 75mm armor-piercing round that penetrated the right side hull, suggesting a flank shot at relatively close range. The examining officers noted the kill in their reports, but had no way of knowing the circumstances under which it was achieved. To them, it was simply another destroyed Tiger, valuable for what it revealed about vulnerabilities in German armor, but not exceptional in any tactical sense.
The wreck was eventually hauled away for scrap, joining thousands of other destroyed vehicles in the enormous salvage operation that followed the war's end. The metal was recycled, melted down, and formed into new products that carried no memory of their origin. This, too, is inevitable and perhaps appropriate. The machinery of war, once the fighting is finished, has no purpose except as raw material. There is something fitting in the transformation of weapons into peaceful tools, of swords into plowshares, even if the transformation erases the history that the weapons embodied. But something is lost in the process, some connection to the human beings who used these machines and who died beside them or inside them. If there is a lesson to be drawn from the engagement at Chaumont, it is perhaps this: that wars are won not just by superior strategy, or industrial capacity, or technological advantage, though all of these things matter. Wars are won by the accumulated decisions of thousands of individual soldiers who choose in moments of crisis to stand when they might flee, to fight when they might surrender, to attempt the unlikely rather than accept the inevitable. These decisions are rarely recognized at the time and often forgotten afterward, absorbed into the broader narrative of victory or defeat. But they are the actual substance of military conflict, the human choices that determine whether armies advance or retreat, whether battles are won or lost, whether the broader strategic calculations of generals and politicians can be translated into reality on the ground. Brennan's decision to engage the Tiger was one such moment, neither more nor less significant than thousands of similar moments throughout the war. It was significant to him, certainly, and to the 7 men whose lives depended on the outcome. It was significant in the narrow tactical sense that it delayed a German advance and allowed American forces to establish more effective defensive positions in that sector. But in the broader scope of the war, in the vast historical narrative that encompasses millions of deaths and the fate of nations, it was barely noticeable. No one's personal memory of the war turned on what happened at Chaumont. No post-war analysis of the Bulge identified the action as a turning point or even as particularly noteworthy. And yet the story persists, recovered from fragments and assembled into something approaching truth, because it tells us something about the war that the grand narratives cannot capture. It tells us that the war was experienced by individual human beings, each with their own perspective and their own understanding of what they were fighting for. It tells us that courage takes many forms, not all of them recognized or rewarded. It tells us that competence matters, that training matters, that the ability to improvise and adapt matters. It tells us that in the chaos of combat, where plans dissolve and doctrine proves inadequate, the war often comes down to individuals making decisions with incomplete information and living with the consequences. The 7 men who withdrew safely from Chaumont that afternoon went on to fight in other battles, to survive or not survive the remainder of the war, to return home or to lie in military cemeteries across Europe. Their names, with the exception of Hammond and Brennan, are not recorded in any account of the engagement. They were ordinary soldiers, mechanics and drivers and radio operators, men who had been swept up in the German offensive and who had the good fortune to survive one more close call in a war that was full of close calls. Whether they understood what Brennan had done for them, whether they appreciated the odds he had overcome, or the risk he had accepted, is unknowable. They were there, they witnessed some part of it, and then they moved on to the next crisis and the next decision. This is the nature of memory in wartime. Events that should be significant get lost in the overwhelming accumulation of other events. Actions that deserve recognition go unremarked because there is no time for recognition, no space for reflection. The war demands constant forward motion, constant attention to the next threat and the next objective. Only later, when the shooting has stopped and the veterans have time to think about what they experienced, do certain moments emerge as significant. And even then, the significance is personal and subjective, filtered through individual perspective and shaped by what came after.
For Brennan, the engagement at Chaumont was apparently not something he dwelled on or discussed frequently. His single interview about the action, conducted 7 years after the war's end, is matter-of-fact in tone, focused on mechanical details rather than emotional content. He describes the problem, a disabled tank, an advancing enemy, and the solution he attempted. He notes that the solution worked, that the Tiger was destroyed, and that the rearguard withdrew safely. He does not describe fear or exhilaration or satisfaction.
He does not claim heroism or extraordinary courage. He simply recounts what happened in the plain language of a man describing a problem he solved, which perhaps is the most telling detail of all. This understated quality is characteristic of many veteran accounts of combat, a reluctance to dramatize or embellish that often frustrates historians seeking colorful narratives. But the reluctance itself is informative. It suggests something about how combat is actually experienced by the people involved as a series of immediate problems requiring immediate solutions, rather than as a dramatic narrative with heroes and villains and clear moral lessons. The emotional weight of combat, the fear and stress and horror, is real and profound. But in the moment, these emotions are subordinated to the practical requirements of survival. The reflection comes later, if it comes at all, and by that time, the person who fought is often unable or unwilling to articulate what they felt. What Brennan felt as he sat in the Sherman's turret, watching the Tiger approach through the gun sight, can only be imagined. Fear, certainly. Adrenaline, that physiological response that sharpens perception and increases heart rate. Perhaps a strange calmness that some people report in moments of extreme danger, a narrowing of focus to the immediate task at hand. Perhaps anger at the situation, frustration at the broken transmission that had put him in this position, determination to make the machine do what it needed to do despite its limitations. All of these emotions are consistent with human responses to extreme stress. None of them can be confirmed from the available evidence. What we know for certain is that he fired twice, that both shots were well aimed and deliberately placed, that his hands were steady enough to hit a moving target at 300 meters with a gun he was operating without assistance. This degree of mechanical competence under stress suggests training that had become instinct, muscle memory that functioned even when conscious thought was overwhelmed by circumstance. It suggests a man who had done the same actions so many times in practice that he could perform them effectively in conditions where failure meant death. This is what military training is designed to produce, soldiers who can function effectively when everything in their biology is screaming at them to flee. The Sherman's gun that Brennan fired was not designed for single-operator use. The normal crew consisted of a gunner who aimed and fired, a loader who handled ammunition, a commander who directed fire and coordinated with other tanks, a driver and an assistant driver who also operated the Hall machine gun. Brennan performed the functions of at least 3 crew members, aiming and firing the gun while also managing ammunition and making tactical decisions without input from a commander. This would have been difficult under ideal conditions and was nearly impossible under combat conditions. That he succeeded suggests either exceptional skill or exceptional luck, and probably both. The technical challenges of what he accomplished should not be minimized. The hand-crank traverse mechanism required significant physical effort to move the turret even a few degrees. The gun sight required precise adjustment to account for range, motion, and ballistics. The firing mechanism required careful timing to catch the target in the brief window when aim was correct. Each of these actions, performed separately, was manageable. Performed together, under stress, while alone in a steel box that was about to become a target for an 88mm gun, represented a test of competence and composure that few soldiers would pass. That Brennan passed this test is worth noting, worth recording, worth remembering, not because it makes him exceptional. Thousands of soldiers performed similar feats of competence under stress during the war, but because it reminds us what was required of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The war demanded from its participants a level of courage and competence that seems almost superhuman when examined from the safety of peacetime. And yet most of them succeeded most of the time, not because they were superhuman, but because they were well-trained, well-led, and determined not to let down the people beside them. This last factor, the social obligation soldiers feel toward their comrades, is perhaps the most powerful motivator in combat. Studies of soldier behavior under fire consistently show that men fight not for abstract causes or patriotic sentiment, but for the people in their immediate unit, the soldiers who share their danger and depend on their actions. Brennan's decision to engage the Tiger can be understood in these terms. He fought not to win the war or to serve American strategic interests, but to protect 7 men who would die if he did nothing. This is not a diminishment of his action, but an explanation of its psychological foundation. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. And that choice is often made easier by the knowledge that others depend on it.
The rear guard that withdrew from Chaumont was disbanded after the action. its members reassigned to other units as the division reorganized during the Bulge. Hammond was promoted to captain and given command of a tank company serving through the war's end. He survived, returned to civilian life, and practiced law in Virginia until his death in 1994. Whether he ever spoke of Chaumont beyond the letter to his parents is unknown. His decision to give Brennan permission to remain in the Sherman was never investigated or questioned, probably because no one above him in the chain of command ever learned of it. It was a decision made in the moment, based on incomplete information that happened to work out. Had it failed, had Brennan been killed without achieving anything, Hammond might have faced questions about why he allowed a soldier to remain in an indefensible position. But it did not fail, and so the decision disappeared into the vast collection of judgments calls that officers make in combat and that are evaluated entirely by their outcomes. This, too, is characteristic of military operations, where success forgives what might otherwise be considered errors in judgment, and failure condemns decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. The line between good leadership and bad leadership is often visible only in retrospect, and even then is subject to debate by people who were not present and who do not bear the burden of making decisions under pressure. Hammond's decision to let Brennan try was neither clearly right nor clearly wrong. It was a gamble based on tactical intuition and a willingness to accept risk. That it paid off makes it look wise. Had it failed, it would have looked foolish. The difference between wisdom and foolishness in combat is often measured in inches and seconds. The German advance through the Ardennes, of which the action at Chaumont was a tiny part, ultimately failed in its objective of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. The offensive ground to a halt in late December, halted by American resistance, deteriorating weather that grounded German air support, and supply problems that left German spearheads without fuel or ammunition. By mid-January, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat, having suffered casualties it could not replace, and having lost equipment it could not rebuild. The Bulge represented the last major German offensive of the war, a final spasm of military power that achieved initial surprise but lacked the resources to sustain success. For the soldiers who fought in the Bulge, these strategic realities were invisible or irrelevant. They experienced the offensive as immediate danger, as chaos and retreat and desperate defense. They did not know that the German advance would fail or that the war would end in 5 months. They knew only that today they were in danger and tomorrow they might be dead. The historical significance of the battle, its place in the grand narrative of the war, was something they would learn about later, if they survived. In the moment, all that mattered was the next hour, the next enemy, the next decision. Chaumont was liberated by American forces on December 23rd, 4 days after the rearguard's withdrawal. The village had been occupied by German troops who used it as a rest area before moving forward. They had ignored or not noticed the memorial stone that marked earlier fighting, had requisitioned food from the remaining civilians, and had moved on when the offensive stalled. The villagers emerged from cellars to find their homes damaged but intact, their church still standing, their cemetery unmarked by fresh graves. For them, the war had passed through twice now, and they had survived both times. Whether they knew about the destroyed Tiger or the disabled Sherman is unrecorded. Probably they knew something had happened. The sound of tank guns is unmistakable, and the smoke from the burning Tiger would have been visible for hours. But the details, the story of how a mechanic held off German armor, would not emerge until decades later. The recovery of forgotten war stories has become something of a minor industry in the decades since World War II ended, with historians and enthusiasts searching through archives and interviewing surviving veterans to document actions that never made it into official histories. This effort has preserved thousands of stories that otherwise would have been lost, giving voice to soldiers whose experiences would have disappeared with their deaths. But it is a race against time, as the generation that fought the war ages and passes, and the primary sources of memory disappear. Each year brings fewer veterans, fewer first-hand accounts, fewer opportunities to ask the questions that might illuminate what actually happened. The story of Chaumont was recovered through this process,
assembled from fragments that individually meant little, but together suggested a narrative. It is probably accurate in its main elements. A disabled Sherman did destroy a Tiger tank in the vicinity of Chaumont on December 19, 1944. The tank was operated by a single soldier, a mechanic named Thomas Brennan. The engagement allowed an American rearguard to withdraw safely. These facts can be confirmed through multiple sources. The details, what Brennan was thinking, how he aimed, whether he was afraid, cannot be confirmed and must remain speculation based on what we know about human behavior under stress and what Brennan himself said years later. This uncertainty is frustrating for historians who prefer definitive accounts, but it is also appropriate. War is experienced in fragments, in moments of terror or confusion or sudden clarity that cannot be fully reconstructed after the fact. The men who live through these moments often cannot or will not describe them fully, and the men who did not survive cannot describe them at all. What we have are pieces of a larger puzzle, enough to see the outline, but not the complete picture. Enough to know that something significant happened, but not enough to know exactly how it felt or what it meant to the people involved. What seems clear from the available evidence is that Brennan's action at Chaumont was neither unique nor typical. It was not unique because hundreds of similar acts of improvisation and courage occurred throughout the war, soldiers finding ways to achieve unlikely victories through skill and determination. It was not typical because most soldiers never found themselves in positions where a single action could have such decisive consequences. Brennan was ordinary in his background and training, exceptional in the specific circumstances he faced and the decision he made. This combination, ordinary person, extraordinary moment, is what makes his story worth preserving.
The preservation of such stories serves multiple purposes. It honors the men who fought, giving recognition to actions that were never officially acknowledged. It provides a more complete picture of what the war was actually like, beyond the strategic narratives and official histories. It reminds subsequent generations of what was required of the people who fought and won. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates that wars are not abstract historical events, but collections of human experiences, each one unique, each one significant to the person who lived it. Brennan's story ends where it began, in Pennsylvania, in a steel town that sent its sons to war and welcomed them back, and tried to forget that the war had ever happened. He lived 50 more years after Chaumont, raised his family, did his work, participated in his community. The war was part of his past, but not the defining element of his identity. He was not haunted by what he had done, at least not visibly. He did not speak of it often or seem to dwell on it. It was simply something that had happened, one event among many in a life that contained multitudes. Whether he thought about the tiger, about the moment when he pulled the firing pedal and watched the round arc toward its target, about the seconds of uncertainty before the impact, is something only he could have answered. Whether he felt pride or relief or guilt or some combination of emotions is unknowable. The historical record preserves what he did, but cannot fully capture what he felt or thought or dreamed about in the decades that followed. This is the limitation of history, the boundary where documentation ends and private experience begins. What remains is the fact of the action itself, preserved in fragments and reconstructed through careful research. A disabled Sherman destroyed a Tiger tank outside Chaumont, Belgium, on December 19, 1944. The tank was operated by Staff Sergeant Thomas Edward Brennan, a mechanic from Pennsylvania. The engagement allowed 7 American soldiers to withdraw safely from a position that would otherwise have been overrun. This much is certain. Everything else, the motivation, the emotion, the meaning, must be inferred from what we know about human nature and what we understand about warfare. But that is enough. It is enough to know that on a frozen Belgian afternoon, a mechanic who understood machines found a way to make a broken machine serve a purpose, and in doing so reminded everyone who later learned of his action that the war was won not just by factories and generals,
but by individuals who chose courage over safety when the moment demanded it. That is the story. That is what survives. That is what we remember when we remember the mechanics and gunners and radio operators who fought and sometimes died in places whose names appeared on no maps and in actions that generated no official commendations, but who mattered desperately to the people beside them and who shaped the outcome of the war in ways that could never be fully measured or completely understood.